I'm Millicent Hughes, and I live in Hamilton, and I'm on the board of directors of the French and Indian War Foundation. I think my lifelong interest in history, inherited from my father, has brought me here. My father was always telling me things like I could be in the Colonial Dames or the Daughters of the American Revolution, and I was like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And when I was about 16, he presented me with a piece of paper that he seemed very proud of, and this was the New England Genealogical Society's version of our family tree. I have two fourth great grandfathers that were in the French and Indian War. And my interest in it is an interest in them, but also an interest in me because I have their DNA. These two gentlemen were Captain Silas Hamilton and Lieutenant Ezra Stevens. They were both born in the Danbury area in Connecticut and lived their rather unknown lives for some years before the wars began and the 1755 Braddock defeat. It's one good thing about wars is that it is a great way to keep track of where your relatives were and what they were doing. Otherwise, many of these people, we would know nothing about their lives other than what might be on their gravestone if you could find it. I have found interesting things about Captain Silas Hamilton, who was one of my fourth great grandfathers, so interesting that I ended up writing a novel about him, 1777 Danbury on Fire. But then I began to feel bad that I had never done anything to respect and honor my other fourth great grandfather, who also lived in Danbury, Connecticut. This was Lieutenant Ezra Stevens. So Ezra was born in 1826, and he married Rachel Knapp, had some children. He had farmland that was adjacent to what is now Route 7, the Candlewood Lake area by Candlewood Shores, if you happen to be familiar with Connecticut. And he disappeared into real life until 1756. Now, in 1755, a certain George Washington accompanied General Braddock down to attempt to get Fort Duquesne from the French. That did not work out well to the point where they had many, many deaths. Well, this was an obvious hint to the governors of the different colonies that they needed a professional army. 1739 saw mandated militia in Connecticut, but these were mainly social clubs of gentlemen who met once a month and cantered or walked around town squares. They were not paid. It was a social sort of situation. Now, the colony of Connecticut had 4 regiments formed. These were paid soldiers, a whole shilling 6 pence per day, every day that their enlistments existed. The enlistments, by the way, acknowledged real life. These men had to take care of their spring farm duties, had to return in time to harvest, or Connecticut, the breadbasket of New England, was not going to be eating high on the hog. So in 1756, Ezra Stevens and the whole Danbury militia as a unit joined the 4th Regiment, 1st Company of the Connecticut State Troops. Now, there were not enough forts, enough commissaries for what they imagined to be necessary. So the first thing that these Connecticuters did was go across the Hudson River to Albany, New York. And there, doubtless to their utter horror, many of them stayed. Captain John Wood and Ezra Stevens, private, never went any further because a plague similar to perhaps E. coli or typhoid became an endemic epidemic that stopped 40 men right in their tracks. They went with 70 men in October of 1756, the Muster Master General in Fort William Henry acknowledged 14 soldiers arriving. There were soldiers in the return muster roll, soldiers left at Danbury, soldiers left sick at Fort Edward, soldiers left sick at Crown Point, and pathetic requests by their relatives for reimbursement of doctor's fees, of transport fees. These men didn't have any transport. You could either get on a ferry to go back down the Hudson, which whether people would be happy on the ferry boat to have disease victims on there or not is questionable. And when you got to Albany to get back home, you would have to hire a horse. Now, this was not Uber horses. It was not easy to find horses that you could rent. And supposedly, the soldiers were due 10 shillings to return themselves from any assignment to their home. Well, when you get into doctors treating and supposed medicines being ordered, these bills became huge that were presented to the assembly. How Ezra got home, we do not know, but we know that both he and Captain Wood and many others recovered. Captain Wood, in the January 1757 paymaster roll, listed 8 deserted, 5 dead or captured. Didn't sound like anyone was interested in finding out which. And that was it for 1756. So in 1757, Ezra enlisted, and not having gone very high in the hierarchy when he was ill, he was a private again. And everybody was going to go up to Fort Edward and commence building there. And there they remained, once again, to their horror. Because on the 6th of August, 1757, the news came out about Fort William Henry being under siege, and things did not look good. The French were creeping closer with entrenchments. After the French trenches came artillery. And it was obvious that Fort William Henry would not survive artillery, and so a deal was made with the British and American forces there that the French would let them leave and take over the fort, and that all the inhabitants of the fort, the Patriots and the British, would be allowed to leave with their sidearms and march peacefully away. That wasn't what happened. No one had informed the 1,000 Indians who thought that they were going to plunder the fort what was going to happen. And when the French opened the gates and the Americans and British went out, they were fallen upon, butchered, tortured, scalped, robbed, to the extent of dead bodies being dug up for their scalps. And all the while, the Connecticut forces sat at Fort Edward only a day's ride away, or even a day's walk away. It was only 15 miles. And just died 1,000 deaths knowing what was going on because the fort had been besieged for a week. The heroic French officers did their best to try to stop what was going on, to try to prevent captives from being taken. It didn't work. And that was 1757 for the Connecticut forces, who then went home for the winter, as was typical. However, Ezra had become a sergeant and then gone up to become a lieutenant, which only says the best things about both his physical and mental stability and stamina. And in 1758, there is news of him transporting guns. And then he falls into silence, only to be heard from again. And in 1775, as the feint against upriver against the British began as a pre-revolutionary activity. And once again, the Connecticut forces were aligned, and a Captain Noble Benedict, who had been an ensign with Ezra in the French and Indian War, was heading the company. And a Lieutenant James Clark from Danbury was lieutenant, as well as Ezra. So you had the captain, 2 lieutenants, and 4 sergeants. And once again, about 65, 68 men went along up the Hudson. And suddenly everything seemed very déjà vu. It was lovely weather when they had left to go to Albany in August. And then it was lovely starting up the Hudson. And there was really no food, but people could eat apples that were ripening on the trees and make deals with farmers. And then it got cold and they were still wearing the clothes from August. And then there was no more food, and each person had a rifle or a musket, but was only issued 5 bullets, and they were told that they must not be used up by shooting at fowl or deer. There must have come a night, maybe a 3-stick fire, and the 3 officers sitting around it. Ezra at 49 was the oldest among them, and they all agreed that the next day was the end of their enlistment, and they turned around and went back to Danbury. No desertion, no death, no battle. And so Ezra resumed real life with his family, and we next hear of him right after the burning of Danbury, which occurred on April 26, 1777. All of the courthouse records were lost. The courthouse was burned, and a commission came from the Connecticut State Assembly, and they appointed certain members of the Danbury Committee of Inspection and veterans. Ezra and Silas Hamilton, my other 4th great-grandfather, were appointed to try to reconstitute the land records of the town. And that became the end of everything that I know about Ezra. He had ended up in the still in the militia with his son Eli with him, but he resumed normal life after the Revolution. And when last we hear of him, he was on his deathbed. This is the only really personal story told about him. A minister approached and asked if he had made his peace with God. And Ezra said, "Well, I always was at peace with God. He and I have never had any disagreements." And with that, the minister felt satisfied and walked away without another word. So thank you so much for listening. Real people, real war.